Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence, by Pauline Maier. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Introduction. Gathering at the Shrine. February 14th, 1995. Speck by speck, said the headline, the nation's vital documents get checkups. After years of preparation, the National Archives was wheeling out the big guns of modern conservation technology to preserve what it calls the Charters of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Normally, those documents are encased in massive, bronze-framed, bulletproof glass containers filled with inert helium gas to displace damaging oxygen and with water vapor to keep the parchment from becoming brittle. During most days, the Charters of Freedom are on display at the Shrine in the National Archives Rotunda, but at night the containers are lowered into a vault of reinforced concrete and steel that, according to a National Archives brochure, is 22 feet deep, weighs 55 tons, and was built by the Mosler Safe Company of Hamilton, Ohio, in 1952, when the Cold War was beginning to make bomb shelters something of a fashion. Once the documents are inside the vault, the brochure says, the massive doors on top swing shut and the documents are safe. But in February 1995, at a time of year when the stream of visitors slows, they were removed from protective custody and scrutinized scientifically for the slightest sign of deterioration. A senior conservator carefully moved a fiber-optic light source over the surface of the Declaration, noting evidence of old bends and of earlier, amateurish repairs. She also took photographs of the document with a 35mm camera, then placed sheets of plastic film over the case and traced the locations of tears, bends, repairs, glue spots, even scars from the animal skins used to make the parchment, confident that her painstaking work would produce invaluable information. Meanwhile, a physicist and, I assume, other conservators examined the Bill of Rights with a computerized imaging system capable of discovering the disappearance or even the fading of the tiniest flakes of 18th-century black iron-based ink, which, it turns out, fades to brown with age, particularly if exposed to light. That was news to me. For decades I've read handwritten 18th-century documents, assuming that brown ink was the style of the time. Even the colors of the past, it seems, can no longer be observed directly. The computerized imaging system, the jewel in the crown of the Archives conservation program, was developed after 1981, when experts suggested that new and better ways be found than those then available to monitor the document's condition. The Archives turned for help to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which, in turn, had engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, design a system for taking precise pictures of the documents that was based, in part, on equipment being created for the Hubble Space Telescope. The Charters Monitoring System that they proposed was built for $3.3 million by what is now Hughes Optics in Danbury, Connecticut, and set up in 1987 at the Archives, which used it to generate a series of baseline images to which those of February 1995 were compared. Essentially, the system consists of a computer-guided electronic camera that scans sample sections of the documents, measuring each dot or pixel of light on a scale of 1 to 1,000 and recording its results. The equipment is mounted on a 6,000-pound granite table that sits on a floor of reinforced concrete. The discovery of haze, when the Bill of Rights had touched glass, prompted consultations with a microbiologist and a glass chemist. The problem seemed worse than when the document was examined in 1988, perhaps because the fiber-optic light source was more sensitive than the incandescent bulb used in the earlier examination. Or was there a real physical change? And if so, was it caused by some chemical reaction between the parchment and glass, or by a living organism capable of surviving without oxygen? The 1995 evaluation confirmed earlier observations of tiny white flakes in the document enclosures that could be sodium coming from the glass, or perhaps the result of other structural changes in the glass. All these phenomena were noted, measured, evaluated, and recorded for future reference. The nation's vital documents have not always been regarded with such reverence, or, for that matter, given much regard of any kind. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was not even copied onto a particularly good sheet of parchment, just an ordinary type of colonial manufacture that could be easily found on sale in Philadelphia, and was perhaps improvidently selected, being improperly cured and sized. The Declaration then went on to become one of the most abused documents in the history of preservation, battered and bandaged since its birth. The Continental Congress probably hauled the document, rolled up, as was the custom with parchment scrolls, with its other papers as it moved from place to place in the course of the Revolutionary War. Later, the Declaration found resting places with the national government at New York, Philadelphia, and, in 1800, at the nation's new capital in Washington, D.C. The Department of State received custody when the Declaration of Independence was still a teenager, but even so it was continually transferred from building to building, or from home to home. When the British invaded in August 1814, a government clerk managed to save the document from destruction. By the time it returned to Washington from its hiding place in Leesburg, Virginia, curiosity seekers found its text, and particularly the signatures, which were written in various qualities of ink, already in bad shape. The wet pressing process used to make a facsimile in 1823 did further damage, and the fading continued after 1841, when the State Department grew tired of pulling the document out to show visitors, and put it on public display for the first time, on a wall in the new Patent Office, opposite a large window, where it remained for 35 years. The document traveled to Philadelphia's Independence Hall for 6 months during the centennial celebrations of 1876, and was subsequently put on display in the State Department's library. By its 100th year, however, the Declaration's decay had become so obvious that the first of many scientific committees was appointed to decide what to do. Generally, the experts recommended keeping the document out of light and, in 1903, as dry as possible, but their advice was not always followed. That was perhaps just as well, since extreme dryness makes parchment crack. Custodians continually sought to protect the document from fire, but no other serious efforts at preservation were made until the State Department transferred the Declaration of Independence to the Library of Congress in 1921. But by later lights, even its efforts seem positively backward. The library set out to display the Declaration with the Constitution in a safe repository that every visitor to Washington would wish to tell about when he returned, and that would be regarded as a sort of shrine. Designed by Francis H. Bacon, whose brother, Henry, served as architect for the Lincoln Memorial, and installed on the library's west wall, that first shrine was opened for visitors in 1924. It was made of marble, except that the Declaration was shown, tipped slightly forward, in an upright frame or case with gold-plated bronze doors made to resemble a conventional altar-piece. Below and in front lay 5 sheets of the Constitution in a larger case with a sloped top. Around the assemblage was a marble balustrade, suggesting the chancel rail before an altar, which pilgrims could enter, single file, for a close look at the charters. Enormous care was taken to preserve the documents. They were covered with double panes of plate glass, between which a gelatin film filtered damaging light rays, and a continuous guard kept watch for thieves and other evil-minded people, as well as for the silverfish someone reported seeing in the Constitution's case, causing near panic. After Pearl Harbor, the library carefully packed the Declaration and the Constitution in an elaborate container, or reliquary, and sent them to the bullion depository at Fort Knox in a Pullman car accompanied by armed Secret Service agents, a library officer, and, through the last lap of its journey, troops of the 13th Armored Division. The Declaration nonetheless suffered greatly from its natural enemies, the great swings in Washington's humidity and temperature before the days of air conditioning and climate control. When restorers examined it in 1942, the parchment was already cracked, a corner had split off, and its edges were curled. Worse yet, earlier efforts to repair damage had included pasting the Declaration to its mounting with copious glue and fixing a crack with cellophane tape that turned the color of molasses and had itself to be carefully removed. The modern method of repair, it seems, consisted in part of luting, or cementing the cracks, with fibers from Japanese tissue moistened with rice paste. Before returning the documents to their container, their surfaces were protected by another covering of Japanese tissue. Did anyone appreciate the irony of using Japanese materials after taking such extreme measures to put our vital national documents beyond the reach of the Japanese and other wartime enemies? The documents were finally placed in their current airtight thermopane containers with an electronic device to detect helium loss in September 1952, a few months before they were transferred from the Library of Congress to the National Archives. Modern scientific document conservation is obviously a very recent development, and it has not advanced equally on all fronts. Our ability to detect problems is growing faster than our ability to solve them, according to a professor of conservation associated with the monitoring program. What to do if we find something becomes the more difficult question, and an important one, it seems. The original signed texts of the Declaration of Independence, and, to a lesser extent, the Constitution, have become for the United States what Lenin's body was for the Soviet Union, a tangible remnant of the revolution to which its children can still cling. What we are struggling to preserve from time is, however, not a physical body, but a physical document that was written to perform a constitutional function. That, too, involves some irony. The heroic efforts invested in conserving the document by which the United States declared its independence from Britain testify to the powerful and enduring influence of British constitutional tradition on American political culture. July 24th, 1995. A meeting at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars adjourns for lunch, giving me a chance to have my first look at our nation's vital documents. Historians seldom need to see the original texts of those documents anymore. Their words are reprinted in every American history textbook and in hundreds of other places. Indeed, facsimile reproductions can be bought in many National Park Service gift shops. The various drafts of the Declaration have also been published, with all the little scribblings on them studied and charted with such care that virtually every piece of information scholars need can be found in a good research library. Curiosity, more than anything, sent me rushing through the hot summer air across the mall to the National Archives. The lines in the rotunda were fortunately short. As I waited my turn, a family behind me discussed the mural above and to the left. Painted in the 1930s, it showed members of the Second Continental Congress, including a cluster of men at the far end that clearly consisted of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. But what interested the family members was George Washington. Where was he in the picture? "That's him, I'm sure that's him," a boy said, referring to a figure in green. Should I tell them Washington wasn't at the Congress, that he was with the Continental Army in New York? "This really makes all that history you read about in school come alive, doesn't it?" commented a woman whom I took to be the mother. Would I have killed the fun by correcting their error? To me, the vital documents themselves seemed pretty dead. In fact, the spectacle had the air of a state funeral. Guards stand at either side of the shrine, dressed in black, and with an air of suppressed deep emotion, breaking silence mainly to ask the line of T-shirted, sneakered tourists to keep moving. In 1944, when the Declaration and Constitution went back on display at the archives, its honor guards were drawn in succession from the Marines, Army, and Navy, and almost certainly consisted predominantly, if not exclusively, of white men. On the day I went, both guards, a woman and a man, were African Americans, which reflected contemporary Washington's civilian workforce, but also contributed to the sense of heavy symbolism. By their presence and attitude of reverence, the guards witnessed the triumph of Abraham Lincoln's view that the guarantee of freedom in the Declaration of Independence extended literally to all men. These documents were their charters of freedom, too, not just those of white Americans, as Stephen Douglas had insisted in the 1850s, and to women as well as men, as feminists of 1848 had argued. The shrine itself resembles the awesome gilded pre-Vatican II altars of my Catholic girlhood, raised 3 steps above where the worshippers assembled. The Declaration is its centerpiece, held above the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in what looks like a tabernacle, or perhaps a monstrance, the device used to display the host on special days of adoration. The Constitution and Bill of Rights are spread out beneath on the altar's surface. Off to the left, as visitors leave, they can see another important document, a version of England's Magna Carta of 1215 that was probably issued in 1297 and that has been lent to the National Archives for an indefinite period by its owner, the Dallas businessman Ross Perot. As the Archives explains, the fundamental constitutional documents of the United States emerged from an old English tradition, and some rights mentioned in our Bill of Rights were asserted, or at least foreshadowed, in the Magna Carta 5 centuries earlier. But it's easy to walk past the Magna Carta without noticing it. It seems not like an ancestor, but a sideshow to the main attraction at the rotunda's far end. The Bill of Rights especially intrigued me. What could the archives have on display? I wondered. The Declaration and Constitution were complete, formal documents, copied onto parchment by order of the Second Continental Congress in 1776, or the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But the Bill of Rights consists of those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that the states chose to ratify from 12 that Congress had proposed in September 1789. When would those amendments have been put on parchment to take their place among our vital national documents? The text on exhibit, I knew, had joined the Declaration and Constitution relatively recently, and not much is known about its history as a physical artifact. The first photograph of the Bill of Rights was taken during its sesquicentennial in 1941, and it was among the documents carried across the land on the Freedom Train from September 1947 through January 1949. It turned out that the document at the foot of the Constitution is Congress's official copy of the 12 amendments it proposed, not the 10 that were ratified. In other words, the Bill of Rights on exhibit is not the Bill of Rights passed into law. The whole assemblage came to seem part and parcel of the 1940s and 1950s, an assertion of American values, religion, free enterprise, naming the companies that contributed to the display, liberty, against fascist and communist enemies, and, with the vault and its massive closing doors, an assurance to the fearful that those values could not be destroyed. The 1960s and 1970s had also left their mark in the changing identity of the Guards. The shrine, in short, is an eloquent monument to the struggles and values of the American people in the mid and late 20th century. Before leaving, I asked one of the attendants whether the documents had been removed from display during the recent preservation evaluation. She seemed shocked at the question. "The documents," she announced slowly with a deep, dramatic Southern drawl, "have been untouched by human hands for 43 years. I began this book against my better judgment. At first, if I recall correctly, I dismissed the suggestion that I write a modern history of the Declaration of Independence. There's already too much written on the subject, I remember saying, and I have no particular interest in adding to the pile. I also thought that the document had been hyped out of all proportion to what was justified, and that more attention would only exacerbate the problem. But what book on the subject would I assign to my students? None, I replied, having concluded after a quick survey that most of the books in print at that time were antiquarian, dated, downright wrong on critical points, or too specialized for undergraduates. So I lost the argument and set out to write what was supposed to be a small book for advanced high school and college students that would tell them what I already knew. But I ended up writing something different, about things I never knew or hadn't thought much about before. This is not the place to discuss earlier studies of the Declaration of Independence. They and their authors will come up at their proper places in this story, except to say that most of them, since Carl Becker's delightful, but now dated, The Declaration of Independence, have examined the Declaration for the political ideas it expressed, and then jumped from its text to the more systematic treatises of 18th-century European writers. Academics, I think, are generally more comfortable there, in the transatlantic world of ideas, than in the grubby world of 18th-century American politics, where, for better or worse, I've spent much of my adult working life. More recently, and without abandoning their taste for the history of ideas and for the European origins of things American, historians, with a few notable exceptions, have also studied the draft that Thomas Jefferson composed for Congress's drafting committee, not the official declaration as Congress approved it, and with an ever more narrow focus. For example, J. Fliegelman's Declaring Independence spends considerable time analyzing Jefferson's pauses, The diacritical quotation marks that Jefferson apparently inserted into his text of the Declaration, and which mistakenly made their way into an early printed version to show where a speaker should pause, and for how long. I had better be as clear as I can on this. I have no doubt that political ideology was critical to the American Revolution, and spent some time a quarter-century ago sorting through the Revolution principles that shaped American resistance to Britain. To me, however, the historical significance of the Declaration did not lie in the principles it stated, except insofar as it restated what virtually all Americans, patriot and loyalist alike, thought and said in other words in other places. And that was exactly what the Declaration was meant to do. It was, according to Jefferson, to be an expression of the American mind, and to give that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. As a statement of political philosophy, the Declaration was therefore purposely unexceptional in 1776. No doubt the document was affected by contemporary rhetorical theory, as Fliegelman and also Stephen E. Lucas argue, and I would be the first to agree that the associationalist psychology of the early 19th century played a role in the esteemed position the document assumed as the 50th anniversary of American independence approached. Those subjects are interesting and have a place in the Declaration's story, but they are not the whole of the story, or the most important aspects of it for us to understand. Perhaps I should also explain that I bear no animus toward Jefferson. True, I once nominated him as the most overrated person in American history for an American Heritage Survey, but only because of the extraordinary adulation, and sometimes execration, he has received and continues to receive. The mythology of Jefferson and the way interpretations of him have reflected Americans' feelings about themselves, as if he were an incarnation of the American nation, has itself been the subject of some wonderful books and essays. It does strike me as odd, however, that historians' obsession with Jefferson continues unabated at a time when studying the history of great white men has become unfashionable in the profession. As this book makes plain, I dissent from any suggestion that Jefferson was alone responsible for the Declaration of Independence, or that the document most worth studying and admiring is his draft, or that the full story of the Declaration can be told apart from that of the independence it declared and the process that led to it. My real problem with most studies of the Declaration of Independence is, in fact, less with what they say than with what they leave out. In a sense, I have written the book Becker was criticized for not writing, and whose value he acknowledged, a book on the Declaration of Independence, regarded as an event, as the culmination of a series of revolutionary activities. And I also, like Becker, trace the document's development, which, in part because new evidence has come to light, looks different today than it did 75 years ago. The tortuous process by which Americans arrived at independence, the political maneuvers that finally allowed Congress to make that decision, the mass of popular resolutions on independence that those maneuvers produced, most of which have gone unnoticed over the past 2 centuries, the way the Declaration was drafted, the circumstances under which the Continental Congress considered it, how Congress changed the version recommended by its drafting committee, all seem to me part of a story worth repeating. That story is not of a solo performance, or even, to extend the metaphor, a performance of chamber music with a handful of players. What I had in mind was more the Boston Symphony Orchestra, or, better yet, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a production with a cast of hundreds, many of whom must remain nameless since we know.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?